Tell me, what is it like to be a red rubber ball? What's your favorite color? So what's your feeling about inflation? Tell us. So I suppose you just bounce through the day. I say, you know. Cheers. Hello, Lenn Johnston, your host and avant-guardian angel, and today we're at the TLC Cafe in Santa Clarita with a squeaky door and people coming and going, and that's what that is. So when you hear it, don't get upset, just know it's reality happening and this is not some staged thing. There are those who claim that time travel is possible. Our guest today is Ivor Davis, Beatles Tour Reporter between 1964 and 1966, and he is the author of The Beatles and Me on Tour. He was their official tour reporter, you see, in America, and he shares his amazing stories with us today, and he will be our time machine taking us back, and we'll not only talk about the Beatles but all the great celebrities and people that you've encountered. Welcome, Ivor.
Thank you, Len, and I must say I've been called many things, but I think Time Machine is very original. I like it, and I may actually adopt that name.
I think it's a good one, you know, just Ivor Davis, and in brackets underneath, Time Machine.
Time Machine, a good idea. You know, in those days we didn't have jet engines, or maybe we did, but you still got from point A to point B, and this is where we're going.
It's where we're going, yeah, and people are all so excited, they're banging on the walls over it here.
I can hear that, and also I brought some oil for the squeaky doors.
That's good.
Which you mentioned, which nobody will know what the heck you're talking about, but
they won't, but they'll hear it periodically.
They will.
So just to bring you up to speed, if you haven't heard Ivor before, we've had some lovely chats on Lenn Johnston's Parallel Universe about his time on tour with the Beatles in America, and we'll probably reminisce and go over some of those stories today. In fact, he mentioned the very first meeting, or the first ever meeting with Elvis Presley and Bob Dylan and people like that, and also Jayne Mansfield.
Lovely Jayne Mansfield, wow.
That's right.
What a voluptuous lady she was.
Yes, she was, and unfortunately she had a little problem with lobsters, as according to Derek and Clive.
Yes.
We can't really get into that.
That's not really.
Malibu, you've got to be careful when you go swimming in Malibu, you know.
Absolutely.
They go right, you know, where you don't want them.
I agree.
So tell us a bit about the very first, the first of one and only meeting with Elvis. What was that like?
Well, it actually happened in the summer of 1965, Len, and the Beatles had been trying for a year to get to meet Elvis, because John, as you know so well, was a fervid fan of Elvis, and grew up listening to Elvis under the covers, Radio Luxembourg. Radio Luxembourg was one of those European channels that played pop music,
right,
before the BBC realised there was pop music. So cut a long story short, a year into the first tour, they never made it with Elvis, and then in August of 65, we got a call, we're going to see Elvis, and we jumped in the limos, Beatles, John and the rest of the gang were in one, and I was in number two, and off we went to visit the house of Presley.
Which was in
Bel Air.
Bel Air, of course. Bel Air adjacent to Beverly Hills, where all the movie stars live.
Exactly.
And what happened?
Oh, you want to know?
Oh, you want to know?
Oh,
yes, I'm going to adjust my seat as we do first, because I'm half on, I'm half in and half out here. You see.
Well, we'll cuddle up a bit closer.
All right, there you go. There you go.
So, the Beatles were very excited. They were very nervous. They had a few cups of tea, like we're having. But the cups of tea.
Oh, is that what that is? I think
yeah.
I'll have a little, you know.
They had which was the code word for other more stimulating chemicals than just plain tea. And by the time we got to the house, there were a lot of girls hanging around, because this was going to be a secret meeting. And it was so secret that he said to me, no tape recorders, no cameras, and you've got to keep your mouth shut, because we don't want any media. And they didn't have any media, and that was ridiculous, because this was historic. So we get in there, and there's Elvis sitting around looking like Elvis with his sideburns kind of like he'd been stuck on, you know, very bushy. You could make a carpet out of the sideburns. They didn't, actually. And there was Priscilla with her belly button showing. I remember Priscilla's belly button very well.
How can you ever forget Priscilla's belly button?
Nobody.
A lovely sight.
It's a part of the history of rock and roll, by the way. Yes, it is. And for the first 15 minutes, Len, they sat around and nobody said anything. There was a TV on with no sound. Elvis was there. And finally, Paul went up and introduced himself. I'm Paul, and so did John and the other boys. And they started a conversation, but very taciturn. And then all of a sudden, Elvis jumped up and said, I'm going to bed. He said, didn't you guys come to jam? I think he was being funny, actually. I don't think he was going to bed. And
well, if you guys aren't going to talk about anything, I'm going to go to bed.
That's pretty good. In fact, it was you were not there? You were not on the time machine?
I could have been. You know, timelines travel backwards and forwards, you know, so you never know.
So there you go.
When you hear that whistle blow, you know.
You know, the train is coming through town. And we better get on the train.
Hang my head and cry.
Get on the first train out of the town there, man. That's terrible, actually.
Johnny Cash and all the rest of them, you know. Johnny, Big River, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So where were we? We were with Elvis.
And Priscilla was going to belly button showing, and then the awkwardness of
Elvis, a shy guy, believe it or not, very shy guy. Didn't like hanging out with people he didn't know. Was okay with the Memphis Mafia, his cohort.
The sycophants, right?
The sycophants who got well paid to be sycophants. I wish I'd got that.
Never get sick of the money though, do you?
Never do when you're a sycophant. Very well, I like that. Anyway, so cut long story short. That broke the ice. They brought out the guitars, they plugged in, and they started jamming for about 25 minutes, but no Beatles songs. A couple of Elvis songs, and that kind of broke the ice. And then after that, they got loosened up a bit. They talked about the fear of flying, because I think Buddy Holly had been killed in a plane crash not long earlier. And they got along moderately well. Parker was playing roulette with Colonel Tom Parker, the manager of Elvis, was playing roulette with Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, and there were drinks served, a lot of lovely girls with belly buttons showing, not only Priscilla but the other girls. I remember that
can't
vividly.
Skip that. No, that's
I mean, it's one of those
lovely, one of those little, you know, bullseye things,
images,
you know,
things you remember.
Things you remember about the 60s, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. And it went on for another hour and a half. And they were chatting away. Ringo went to play snooker, billiards, or whatever they called it then. Snooker. And they got on pretty well. And they said they would. And the other funny thing was that Paul said to Elvis, and I was standing in the back, kind of like the fly on the wall. He said, you know, it's a pity, Elvis, you don't make the kind of music you made earlier. And Elvis kind of took offence to that. Because
that's Paulie being Paulie, you know.
He did, and well, Paul just said it.
He said it.
And Elvis felt a little bit peeved, because it gave the impression that the Beatles felt that Elvis was not singing the kind of music that made him a star. And he actually felt that way, because that was the way Elvis was. Anyway, a long story short, they left, and then the Beatles at the time said they weren't too bowled over with Elvis, they weren't too impressed with him. But a few years later, Elvis badmouthed the Beatles, and he went to see Richard Nixon.
About the drugs.
And the reason he went to see Richard Nixon, as you know, was that he wanted Richard Nixon, the president, to give him an honorary drug enforcement badge. And the vision of him going to see Richard Nixon, badmouthing the Beatles, to get his little badge, his tin badge, and then he pulled out a gun and gave it to Nixon from his collection.
Amazing, and he flew with that too. There's actually a little funny side note. They actually put out a film, I think it's called Elvis Meets the President or something. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen it, but I've heard about
it. There's snippets of it on YouTube, on the internet, and just look for the one Elvis robs the donut shop. It's really a laugh.
I'll have to look at that.
Laugh.
But the interesting thing was that the Beatles were very upset that Elvis badmouthed them, saying they went back to England, they took all the money they earned in America, and they badmouthed America, but they didn't do that, as
That's
you know.
That's not true, never.
Definitely not true. But then I discovered from Elvis's half-brother David Stanley, who came up to me in an event, said, yeah, I was there in Graceland when Elvis went to see Richard Nixon, and Elvis was zonked, totally out of his mind. But he got his badge, because if Elvis had been pulled over on the freeway or wherever, he would have said, and if he was zonked, he would have said, you can't do much with me, here's my badge, I'm a DEA guy.
You got it.
And that was the experience. And though, as you know, Len, the Beatles didn't like him that much after that, but Elvis actually liked the Beatles' music, and he actually sang and recorded a few songs.
He did, didn't he? Another funny thing about that DEA, Nixon was the one who created, supposedly, the war on drugs. You know?
Exactly.
And there's a funny little thing that people don't know about. Here's a little side note. If you're not careful here on Lenn Johnston's Parallel Universe, you may learn something. But President Lincoln, the American President Lincoln, back in 1862 passed a thing called the Lieber Code, which I believe it was called the Lieber Code, which basically was how do people conduct themselves during a time of war. And it was never lifted. To this day, it was never lifted, and some people contested it back in the 1960s. Well, war, there's no war here. So Nixon turns around and he puts this, well, we got a war on drugs. And that's what started the whole thing. So even though it's a concept, it's still considered a war, you know?
Well, the irony, Len, as you can see, and I'm sure your millions of viewers and followers, that Elvis was the biggest drug taker on the face of the earth.
He was. And
so it was kind of horribly ironic.
Hypocritical, whatever. Pretty sad, really, the way he left this earth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And now you mentioned Jayne Mansfield as well. So they were nonplussed with Elvis, but they had a meeting with Jayne Mansfield at, what was it, the Whiskey a Go-Go or someplace?
Correct. Well, I mean, Jayne Mansfield was a gorgeous, voluptuous lady. She'd been groomed to be the next Marilyn Monroe, if Marilyn Monroe stepped out of line. However, she never quite made that big time, but she knew how to do PR. And she wanted to meet the Beatles. First of all, the Beatles and Brian said no, but then she invited John, who had an eye for voluptuosity.
Yes, he had a good eye for those things.
To the Whiskey Go-Go. And it was supposed to be a private table away from the prying eyes, but when we got there to the whiskey, we'd been tipped off they were going to the whiskey. Paul wasn't there, he was off with Peggy Lipton, who was a beautiful...
Peggy Lipton, yeah,
her?
know Peggy Lipton, of course.
Another gorgeous young lady, still around, of course.
Yeah.
And so we went to the Whiskey Go-Go, and when we got there was the paparazzi there. And the Beatles were trapped in a booth with Jayne, and I think John, from what Jayne said, was kind of squeezing her knee to get her attention. I think probably, whatever, I mean, why else do you squeeze a beautiful woman's knee?
Of course.
And George was getting drunk.
Let me squeeze your knee.
That's it.
Yeah.
If you ever find anybody squeezing your knee, you know why.
No.
Anyway, sorry. So here we are in the booth, crowded by paparazzi. George is getting drunk, very upset of being trapped in this booth. And he suddenly says to a photographer who had this big camera with a big bulb, and every time they let the flash off, it blinded you. He says, "Sir, would you mind leaving?" Well, he actually didn't quite say in those words. When you've had about 4 or 5 rum and cokes,
right?
You can imagine what George said to the photographer. Whereas the photographer completely ignored him. Did another picture. George got his drink and he threw it at the photographer. However, he was not good at throwing drinks on people, and the drink splashed on another beautiful lady in the next booth called Mamie Van Doren. Mamie Van Doren was another voluptuous actress. There was Marilyn, there was Jayne, and there was Mamie.
He started the very first ever wet T-shirt contest. Though,
that was it. That was it. Poor Mamie got soaked, and all hell broke loose, and the Beatles were lifted by the security guys out of the booth into the limo, and off they went. The next day, as we were leaving LA, George picked up the newspaper and said, rather strongly, "Oh, isn't this terrible?" They actually used a stronger phrase.
Yeah.
There was a picture of George throwing a drink on the photographer, and it was a classic picture on the front page. And George was very upset by that. but they let themselves in for that, and all good deeds never go
unpunished.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was what happened.
It was a setup. It was another setup.
Exactly.
A media circus.
Indeed.
In a pit of sharks.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it, if I may say.
Yeah. What do? You can't sort of chum the waters with anything else when you are the chum.
And you're trapped. There's no way you can get out cleanly, and they were trapped, and they were very upset by Jayne's little game.
Jayne.
Wow.
Jayne, get out of here, you hussy! I kicked her in the head. I throws her down the steps. Jayne ended up in Peter Cook and Dudley Moore's bed. Remember that?
Well,
Jayne, get out of here, you hussy!
Yeah, unfortunately, Jayne also after she ended up in Peter Cook.
We know.
Rather badly, but anyway, that's another story for another time.
Right. Now, you also happen to be. Now, here's an historic moment for you. The moment when the Beatles met Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan. Well, tell us.
Well, what happened was on the last day of the first American tour, they were great fans of Dylan. They loved his music. They heard his first album in Paris in February 1964. They were bowled over by Dylan, and they wanted to meet him. And they did meet him, but they were moving around from city to city. And finally, the day before they left, there was a charity performance in downtown New York. Dylan came, and they all came back to the hotel at the edge of New York Airport, edge of Kennedy Airport. And I saw this scruffy-looking fellow with a backpack, and I thought, he looks familiar, and it was Bob Dylan. And in he went, because we all were on the same floor as the Beatles in those days. I mean, you can't get near the talent today. We were in the next room, and on comes this guy, Bob Dylan, and he goes into the room with Brian and the Beatles and Mal and Neil, the road managers, and he produces a rather large marijuana cigarette. Now, the Beatles were not familiar with large marijuana cigarettes, and particularly Ringo. And when they lit up and gave Ringo the fag, as they used to call it, the ciggy,
smoking the fag,
Ringo thought he had to smoke the whole thing.
He was, Ringo.
But he didn't know the protocol. I mean, most of us would have known 3 puffs, it's your turn, Len.
Share it.
Share alike.
Share, that's fair.
So Ringo then puffed the whole fat cigarette, and when I saw him, he was on his knees giggling on the floor. And because when the door opened, and they had all put towels around the outside of the door so that the smoke didn't engulf us in the next room. There was Ringo on his knees. Everybody else was pretty well merry, baked, yes.
Happy.
And that was they all had a terrific time, which most of them didn't remember exactly what went on, but I could see what was going on and what had happened, and Ringo had a good time. He had the best time of all.
He had a lovely time.
And I think from then on they realized when somebody gives you a rather large joint, you share it. And I think from then on they shared alike. And that was the story, and that was Dylan's experience. He went on, as you know, to stay with John in London. They kept their friendship going. Stayed with John and Cynthia.
Grasp. When they say something is white, you think white, but when you've seen something so pure as white, and it just, gets in you, especially after you've had a night like you've had, obviously, it just makes things really go.
Oh no, I look out and all I see is colors, man. I just see colors. So.
That's good. Colors are good. Colors are very good.
I think personally the real rivalry, people say the rivalry of the songwriting between John and Paul, really I think the real rivalry was between John and Bobby.
Well, don't forget, I mean there was rivalry, as everyone knows, between John and Paul, but they worked together pretty well over the years, I think.
Oh, pretty well.
They turned out a few little ditties.
Yes. They're coming with the rest of our dinner. Yes. Let's see, Baked Alaska.
Baked Alaska's coming?
Yes, unfortunately it's baked, it's already melted.
Yeah. In this heat. Everything melts.
This is a good place to take a little pause. We'll be back with more of Lenn Johnston's Parallel Universe and our GenerationRadio.com. And our guest today is Ivor Davis, author of The Beatles and Me on Tour.
Why do you have a chord in the
A chord? It's because I don't want to flow out into outer space. It's it's the gravity. He's the mothership, you know. I don't want to lose my composure, and you know, because I've had enough helium, I could end up on the celium, you know. So we last left off. We were talking about Jayne Mansfield and Bob Dylan.
Yeah, Bob Dylan we've actually covered. Bob Dylan provided them with adequate sustenance in the way of a large cigarette, which you are supposed to inhale. And the story was, of course, that everybody enjoyed themselves that night, including Ringo. Yeah, too much. Ringo was a bit prostrate on the floor when I last saw him, giggling ferociously. And then the Beatles went on to find their own blandishments you can smoke and swallow.
Later on
in life,
as you discovered from the lyrics and the music as it changed.
Indeed.
Tell us about some of your other encounters, which are, by the way, in the book. This book is available at ivordavis.com. Is that
Very good. Yeah, www.ivordavisbeatles.com, and it's a terrific gift for anybody who likes the rock group from Liverpool.
Yes, and remember, holidays are fast approaching, so you want to get out and get one now so you can get it there in time.
Indeed, thank you.
You're welcome. So, tell us about some of the late nights in the hotels and the carrying on and all the madness that surrounded the hurricane, as it was called.
It was an unbelievable journey. I never knew what to expect when I first showed up in San Francisco in 1964, because I'd never experienced anything like it. But we went from city to city. Every day we were somewhere else. The Beatles didn't know where they were, except they were on their own jet, which we travelled on, their private jet, in the limousines, number 1 and number 2. They were in 1 and I was in number 2. And we were trapped as prisoners in every hotel across North America. And the poor Beatles never got a chance to see any of America. They saw wonderful hotel suites, they saw press conferences, they saw stadiums with lousy sound systems, and they saw from start to finish screaming girls who drowned them out. Otherwise, it was a wonderful trip.
Yeah, as they said, they asked them, have you been to, what was it, Niagara Falls or someplace? And George says, we've seen photographs of it.
Exactly.
That was it, you know.
And they never saw anything. They wanted to visit Vegas. Vegas, a city built in the desert. John was bowled over with that.
Fascinating,
but
right?
They didn't leave their room. They brought the gambling machines up to their room, and it was too dangerous to go into the casino. So the Beatles saw Las Vegas, a hotel room, and that was it. And that was the way it was almost every step of the way.
The madness and the women and the carrying on and everything.
There were women, actually.
There were women. Let's hear about the women, shall we?
Well, there were women. I mean, a lot of young women wanted to hold the Beatles' hand and maybe hold other things. But you never know. I mean, you know, a glass of whiskey. But anyway, cut long story short, there were young women who wanted to meet the Beatles, and sometimes they met the Beatles and sometimes they didn't. We had Miss Valencia, Miss Santa Monica, Miss wherever they were.
Miss Santa Clara, Santa Clarita.
Miss Santa Clarita was definitely there.
Not Santa Clara. That's
she was there.
Someplace up north.
That is up north, yeah.
No.
Miss Santa Clarita came into the room, took a look at the Beatles. The Beatles took a look, had a picture taken, and if she was over the age of consent, then they would dance with the Beatles or whatever. Because the Beatles were young, healthy young men. Nobody was married except John, and they kept that a secret, as you know. No. Poor Cynthia was
back at home with Julian, taking care of the baby.
And Brian Epstein, the manager, said, keep the fact that John is married a secret. Although, on the Ed Sullivan Show,
they had to go tip it off to everybody. Sorry, girls, he's married, right? Yeah.
Brian was very upset because Brian felt the Beatles should be, you know, footloose and fancy free so that the fans could adore them, and the fans did
more,
adore
yeah,
them.
and they still did. They were lucky.
They were.
Because I could have. Really, he was right. He was smart in that regard.
He was, and he was very smart when he cleaned them up. When he saw them in the cavern, they were greasy kids with leather jackets and greasy hair. They smoked. They turned their backs on the audience, and they told jokes to each other. And Brian said, "Cut that out. Put them into these suits." And actually,
and
the
Nazi
image.
salutes in Germany as well.
Oh, well, that's another.
The Germans loved it though. They ate it up. There's crazy Brits, you know.
But you know who was the king of the Nazi salute?
Oh, John, of course. What was the famous balcony bit in, what was it, Australia?
Australia and Liverpool.
And he's off doing the Nazi salute. They're just dead chuffed with themselves, and there's all these people who say, "Oh, we could be like Hitler off here or something," you know.
Well, as you know only too well, Len, because you know, I mean, you're in, you know John, you are John, you're in the skin of John. Your name may not be John, it may be Len, but you know the mindset of John. He was a provocateur.
Yes, he was.
He liked to make trouble.
Yes, a rabble-rouser, cheeky devil, all that.
All those things. And he had a lightning-fast mind. The only people that had lightning-fast minds that I've met in my time are Robin Williams and Peter Sellers, who also had a lightning mind.
Yes, we were going to talk about him, because Peter Sellers actually was a very, very good friend of the Beatles, and this is a good way to dovetail into your new book, which you're writing at this moment. You may not have a pen in your hand, or a pen in your foot is fine, or as he says, or your keyboard in front of you, but you are writing it now.
I am writing another book,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, it's basically tentatively called There's a Dead Cat Under the House, but I've got to interview Julia Roberts. And the reason I have that ridiculous title, and everybody says throw it out with the dead cat, was one day, a house I owned and rented, a woman called me up and said, "Come over immediately, there is a dead cat under the house." And I said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hopkinson," or whatever. I have in 1 hour to interview Julia Roberts about her marriage to Kiefer Sutherland. And I left the dead cat under the house and went off to interview Julia Roberts. And that was my life, interviewing these personalities over a period of about 40 or 50 years. Some fun stories, interesting people. Alfred Hitchcock. We all remember Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah,
Hitch. Great character. Wonderful.
Good evening. Tonight we are speaking with Mr. Ivor Davis.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Len, for introducing me. But that was, I mean, Hitchcock was big time.
Yeah.
Big time. A lot of great movies that we know about. The one in the shower scene with Miss Curtis.
Yeah.
Remember what happened to her?
Yeah.
But that's another story, because everybody in that movie Psycho, everybody called Hitchcock up and said, "How dare you show a woman being stabbed to death?" And Hitchcock said, "No."
I didn't. He didn't.
He didn't.
It's like Polanski never showed the baby in Rosemary's Baby.
That's right.
He never did. He never saw the baby.
And talking about Polanski, another interesting character who I got to know, because I was around when, sadly, tragically, Sharon Tate got murdered.
Lord.
And I remember vividly, and if I'm going off key, bring me back.
It's all right. It's all free form here. It's all radio, TV, you know. We can do
Well,
what
the interesting thing about Polanski was he was a filmmaker. He'd made Rosemary's Baby. He'd made a lot of other films like Repulsion and some horror films. And the terrible tragedy was the day or two after Sharon Tate was murdered with her friends in Bel Air, Polanski came back from Europe, and everybody, the media tackled him as if he was a murder suspect. And I remember sitting in that room with Polanski, and he was shattered. He lost his wife and his unborn baby, and the media were treating him like he was a suspect. And Polanski went on to make other great movies, and then he ran away from America, but that's another story.
As they say, yeah. But what a thing for him to come back to that and then be attacked and accused for it. But so getting back, sort of a time machine, going back a little further here to Peter Sellers. We were talking a little bit prior to the cameras rolling here. We were talking about the amazing genius and also eccentricities of Peter Sellers, who was a good friend of the Beatles.
He was.
And how he got on with film producers and directors and just everyone, his family in general. Tell us a little about that.
Well, first of all, Peter Sellers was adored by John. John loved a show in England which most of us remember. You're much younger than I am, but you remember.
The Goons.
The Goon Show.
Right.
And John...
Harry Seacombe and Spike Milligan.
Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers.
Peter Sellers.
With all these incredible radio characters that John adored.
Blue Bottle. And
Blue Bottle.
Right. What does he do there?
Very good.
I've had lessons.
You've had lessons. Well, so the Goons and Peter Sellers were high on the list, and in fact, many years later, Ringo made a movie with Peter Sellers, and I think it was called The Magic Christian.
That's the one.
And but anyway, going back, Peter Sellers lived in Hollywood, was a brilliant, erratic, irrational man, a genius as well, in his own right. And the story I love to tell is when I went on the film set of Alice Be Toklas, a movie on Sunset Boulevard they were shooting, done by the film director Paul Mazursky, and in the middle of a scene, Peter Sellers suddenly stopped dead and pointed across the room, and everybody said, "What's wrong, Peter? What's the problem?" He said, "There's a woman wearing purple. I refuse to have anybody wearing purple on my film set. Get her out of here."
See, I'd have been right with him on that. Purple is right out.
I mean, I don't know whether it was purple people ethers, but he didn't want purple.
Just for that particular day, you know. Now, had it been a Tuesday...
The delusion of time lives inside your head. It's a bottomless pit, a never-ending fret. But the past is dead and buried and gone. Be here now and live on and on. You're never-ending, you're never-ending. Be the light, 'cause you're a shining star. The pain you fear is so unkind. But look again, it's all inside your mind. A pack of lies, nothing real to dread. Free your mind, 'cause you have been misled. You're never ending, you're never ending. Be the light, 'cause you're a shining star. Be the light, 'cause you're a shining star. Be the light, 'cause you're a shining star.
Whew. It's quite good, look at that. Oh. Charming.
Oh man, look at that. Can we get some of that? You know, there's yeah. You know, there's
The Silkies.
two lovers next to two dogs loving, and there's just you know, if we could get a little bit of that, I think that's something.
Yeah, get a little of that in the camera there, Tom.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man.
So this is even nicer. I say I'll live here one day. Don't you think so, Zim?
Oh, you know, I think you can buy real cheap now, from what I hear. Everything's you know, being redistributed.
Right. It's all in foregone conclusions now. So they say, one minute you got money in a house, and the next minute you're homeless, and you got a cow that won't give milk, and a daughter with braces on her teats.
That's all right. I don't drink milk anyway.
Liquid bovine mammary excretion, Zim?
Maybe something like it.
It's about what you get from the commander of sheep.